The German crews operating the MG42s weren't just relying on the raw firepower of their weapons. They had developed tactical approaches that multiplied the gun's already devastating effectiveness. One common technique that infantry veterans reported was what some called mowing the grass, where the gunner would deliberately aim low, targeting soldiers' legs and midsections. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill everyone outright, but to wound men and drop them in the surf where they would drown or bleed out, and then the medics who tried to help them would become additional targets. Another tactic involved pairs of guns working together, where one gun would fire tracers high above the beach, creating the impression that the gunners were overshooting their targets and giving soldiers a false sense of hope that they might be safe if they kept low, while a second concealed gun positioned elsewhere would be firing at the correct height and doing the actual killing. These methods were simple, brutal, and effective enough that they caught many troops completely by surprise, even soldiers who had received extensive training about what to expect. As those first waves of soldiers hit the sand, all the careful planning and tidy operational orders fell apart almost immediately. Casualties mounted at a terrifying rate. Small groups of men began moving forward on their own initiative, using whatever scant cover existed on what was essentially a barren beach. Training had taught them to move during the brief pauses when an MG42 stopped firing, those few seconds when the crew had to change ammunition belts or swap out an overheated barrel. Officers and sergeants shouted at their men to sprint during those precious intervals, and some men made it, while others fell in the attempt. On one sector of the beach, a sergeant managed to gather a small team together, including a soldier carrying a bazooka, and they assaulted strongpoint WN-61, which had been lashing the beach with continuous fire. They blasted a 50mm anti-tank gun that had been supporting the machine gun positions, then crawled forward under fire and systematically knocked out the machine gun posts one after another in close quarters fighting. In that single engagement, they killed 7 German defenders and destroyed 2 gun positions, losing 1 man killed and another wounded. That one action relieved pressure on 3 separate sections of the beach, allowing hundreds of soldiers to advance who otherwise would have been pinned down or killed. The pattern repeated itself up and down the beach, though not every assault succeeded. The decisive moments almost always came at extremely close range, within arm's length of the German positions. Assault teams would hurl grenades and satchel charges directly into the firing ports of bunkers, then shoot any survivors who tried to escape as they rushed inside. Flamethrowers proved particularly effective, their streams of burning fuel searing through the narrow embrasures and neutralizing the nests in seconds. Once American forces had finally broken through the beach defenses and gained the high ground, some German gunners who were wounded, running low on ammunition, or simply cut off from any hope of retreat, attempted to surrender. Given the horrific casualties they had inflicted, not every white flag was accepted or honored. By early afternoon, however, the momentum had clearly shifted. Small pockets of American infantry and combat engineers had seized the high ground overlooking the beach, systematically destroying or bypassing the remaining defensive positions. An official after-action report from Omaha Beach concluded that the bluffs were ultimately taken through nothing less than the undaunted courage of the infantry and engineers. This assessment, coming after the pre-landing bombardment, had so clearly failed to accomplish its objectives. When the MG42s finally fell silent, the change was immediate and dramatic. Beach exits opened up, armoured vehicles pushed inland, isolated footholds linked together, and the invasion gained the momentum needed to roll forward. MG42 crews would continue fighting throughout the Normandy campaign, particularly in the dense hedgerows of the bocage country, but they would never again be concentrated so densely, and they would never again have another opportunity to halt the Allied advance in a single day. For the Allied infantrymen experiencing this from the receiving end, facing an MG42 was an experience of pure terror that many would remember for the rest of their lives. A large portion of the men in those first waves had never been under actual combat fire before. They heard the weapon long before they could see the beach itself, that distinctive tearing, ripping sound that veterans said could literally freeze your blood in your veins. When the landing craft ramp slammed down and instinct screamed at you to lie flat and stay put, leaders had to bellow at their men to move or die where they stood. The shoreline offered almost no shelter whatsoever. One army medic named Ray Lambert later recalled watching rounds slicing through the water and hitting men who were already floundering and struggling in the surf. On the sector designated Dog Green, one entire company suffered casualties approaching 90% within just the first few minutes of landing. Yet despite this, men continued pushing forward, some because of orders, some from a sense of duty, some because they understood that stopping meant absolutely certain death. From the opposite side of those gun sights, the perspective was entirely different, but equally harrowing in its own way. On strongpoint WN62, positioned above Omaha Beach, a 20-year-old German soldier named Heinrich Severlo manned an MG42 as dawn broke that morning. He would later describe the Allied armada bearing down on the coast as something that seemed unreal, like a nightmare vision. When the first landing craft came into effective range, he opened fire and kept feeding ammunition belts into his weapon for hours on end, firing nearly 12,000 rounds over approximately 9 hours of continuous combat. His assistant gunner was gone, killed or fled, he wasn't sure which. Comrades around him fell throughout the day. The entire experience felt utterly futile to him. No matter how many soldiers he hit, more kept coming in endless waves. By early afternoon, with his ammunition exhausted and the position collapsing around him as American forces overran nearby bunkers, he grabbed a rifle and ran, scrambling through shell craters and hedgerows until darkness fell. Surrounded the following morning with no hope of escape, he surrendered to American troops, being very careful not to advertise the fact that he had been an MG42 gunner, knowing that revelation might cost him his life. Many German gunners didn't get the chance that Severlo had. Some died inside their bunkers, killed by grenades or flamethrowers, or simply buried alive when demolition charges collapsed the structures on top of them. Some who were captured alive expressed genuine astonishment at being spared, given the terrible carnage their weapons had inflicted. The psychological scars from that day cut in both directions. Allied veterans never forgot the MG42's fury and the friends they lost to it. German survivors carried memories of the faces in their gun sights that would haunt them for decades. The neat diagrams in training manuals and tactical textbooks couldn't possibly capture what it actually meant to close with an MG42 position. It meant crawling forward to within a few meters under sustained heavy fire, literally betting your life that the gunner wouldn't spot you in time to swing his weapon around. More than a few soldiers fell just steps away from their objective, dying within sight of success. Inside the bunker, when American troops finally broke through, the fights were short, savage, and final. For the MG42 crews, these were the moments they had dreaded throughout the entire battle. The same thick concrete walls and narrow firing ports that protected them from frontal attack became a trap when attackers got close enough. Your choices came down to fighting to the death or attempting to surrender, and neither option felt remotely comforting. The MG42 teams understood perfectly well that they were priority targets, and many feared reprisals if captured. The majority of Allied troops did abide by the Geneva Convention of 1929 and took prisoners according to the rules. However, there are documented accounts of MG42 gunners being shot immediately upon capture by soldiers who had literally just watched their friends get cut down moments before. It's difficult to summon professional detachment and follow the rules of warfare in the seconds immediately following a massacre when rage and grief are still overwhelming. That uncertainty about what would happen if they surrendered hung over every decision German gunners made in those final moments of a losing fight. The reality is that not every German manning an MG42 that day was a committed follower of the regime. Some were conscripts from occupied territories in Eastern Europe, men fighting more out of fear of what would happen to them and their families if they refused than out of any political loyalty. A few surrendered as soon as they concluded that holding out was hopeless. Others fought on until killed or overwhelmed, convinced that surrender wouldn't save them anyway, that they would be shot regardless. The mental strain of this situation was absolutely crushing. Hearing footsteps on the concrete roof above your position, waiting for the inevitable thud of a grenade dropping through the firing slit, knowing your death was seconds away. And when the end finally came, whether through death or capture, it wasn't necessarily a relief for those who survived. There are reports, though rarely properly documented in official records, of isolated reprisal killings during the broader Normandy campaign, particularly targeting captured MG42 crew members. Such incidents were seldom recorded in any detail, overshadowed as they were by the larger triumph of successfully establishing a new front in Western Europe that would ultimately help bring the war to its conclusion. Survival didn't erase the memories for those German soldiers who lived through it. Men like Saverlo returned home to farms and quiet towns across Germany, carrying with them a burden of memory they couldn't forget and often couldn't discuss. Saverlo himself spoke very little about what happened at Omaha Beach for decades after the war ended. Only much later in life did he begin reaching out to families of his fallen comrades, and he eventually even met with David Silver, an American veteran he had wounded during the battle. Two former enemies sat down together, something that would have been utterly unimaginable in 1944, and found at least a small measure of peace through their conversation. Many German veterans of that day led quiet, unremarkable lives after the war, discussing the MG42 and their experiences with it only with others who could truly understand what they had been through. For these men, the weapon represented both a point of professional pride in their technical proficiency and a profound private burden of what they had done with it. In the countless memoirs and histories written about the Normandy invasion, whenever an author writes that a machine gun opened up on troops, they almost always mean an MG42. The weapon's impact echoed through decades of films and popular culture. Movies like The Longest Day and Saving Private Ryan kept its distinctive buzzsaw sound alive in public consciousness, ensuring new generations would know that terrible noise. Meanwhile, the actual concrete bunkers built along the Normandy coastline still stand to this day, silent physical reminders of the weapon's power and the deep scars it carved into the memories of those on both sides who experienced its fury. Walking those beaches today, you can still see the firing ports where men crouched and aimed their weapons at the incoming boats, and you can trace the overlapping fields of fire that made the beach such a deadly killing ground. Understanding what happened to these MG42 crews requires understanding the broader context of how Germany had prepared for an inevitable invasion. By late 1943, everyone knew the Allies would attempt a landing somewhere along the Atlantic coast. The only questions were where and when. The man in charge, whose name we won't dignify by repeating, had declared that any invasion must be defeated on the beaches themselves, that once the Allies established a solid foothold, it would become impossible to push them back into the sea. This strategic assessment, whatever else you might say about its source, was essentially correct. So the Germans poured enormous resources into fortifying the coastline, what they grandly called the Atlantic Wall, though in reality it was far from the continuous line of fortifications that propaganda suggested. The defences were strongest at major ports and at locations where beaches seemed most suitable for large-scale landings. Normandy, despite eventually being chosen by the Allies, wasn't initially the most heavily fortified sector because the Germans believed the invasion would most likely come at Pas-de-Calais, where the English Channel was narrowest. The resistance nests varied considerably in their construction and armament. The most elaborate were massive concrete structures housing large-caliber coastal artillery pieces capable of engaging ships many miles offshore. Others were smaller pillboxes and bunkers designed specifically for machine guns and mortars to cover the beaches themselves. Some positions incorporated steel cupolas that could rotate to change the gun's direction while providing excellent protection for the crew. Others were simpler affairs, essentially reinforced dugouts with sandbag protection. What they all shared was careful sighting to maximize their effectiveness. German engineers would study the approaches to each beach, identifying where troops would most likely land and where they would try to move once ashore, and then position their guns to cover those exact areas. The MG42 was ideal for this role because of its sustained rate of fire and its ability to keep firing for extended periods if properly maintained and supplied with ammunition. The typical German defensive position wasn't just the gun and its crew sitting in isolation. These positions were designed as part of integrated systems. Behind the beach itself, additional weapons were positioned to cover the exits and approaches from the shore to the interior. Minefields channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones. Obstacles in the water, including steel hedgehogs and Belgian gates and wooden ramps tipped with mines, were designed to tear open landing craft or detonate them before they could reach the sand. Barbed wire created barriers that would slow infantry and force them to bunch up while cutting through it, making them easier targets. Artillery observers positioned inland would call down fire from guns located miles behind the coast, adding indirect fire to the direct fire coming from the beach defences. In theory, this created a defence in depth that would exact horrific casualties from any attacking force. The men assigned to these positions in the months leading up to the invasion often developed routines. They would improve their positions, add more sandbags for protection, stockpile ammunition and supplies, rehearse their sectors of fire, and wait. The waiting was its own form of psychological pressure. They knew the invasion was coming, but not when or exactly where. Every morning might be the morning. Every ship spotted on the horizon might be the vanguard of the armada. This created a wearing tension that dulled with time as weeks turned into months without the expected assault materializing. Some soldiers grew complacent, convinced the invasion might never come or might hit somewhere else entirely. Others remained perpetually on edge, and the strain showed. When the invasion finally came in the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, many German units were caught at less than full readiness despite months of preparation. Some troops were away from their positions on various details. Command and control were hampered by earlier Allied bombing of communications infrastructure and by strict orders that prevented local commanders from acting decisively without higher authorization. The airborne landings behind the beaches in the hours before dawn created enormous confusion about what was actually happening. Were these small raids, or the prelude to something larger? Initial reports were fragmentary and often contradictory. By the time the massive naval armada became visible offshore and all doubt vanished, it was too late for the Germans to substantially shift their deployments or bring up significant reserves to the threatened beaches. The pre-landing bombardment that Allied forces delivered was genuinely awesome in scale, but ultimately disappointing in results. Hundreds of heavy bombers had attacked during the night and early morning hours, but cloud cover and strict orders to avoid accidentally bombing the incoming landing craft meant that many bombs fell well inland, completely missing the beach defences. The naval bombardment that followed delivered thousands of tons of high explosives onto the target area, but reinforced concrete proved remarkably resistant. Guns firing from ships several miles offshore lacked the precision to put shells directly through firing slits, and while the bombardment certainly suppressed some defenders and destroyed some positions, many survived intact. When the barrage lifted and the first landing craft approached the shore, German troops emerging from their shelters to man their weapons found that they still had functioning guns and clear fields of fire. The experience of those first few minutes varied considerably depending on which beach sector you landed in. On Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing area, troops came ashore about a mile south of their intended landing point due to strong currents. This accidental displacement turned out to be fortunate because the defences where they actually landed were lighter than those at the planned location. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno and Sword, specialised armoured vehicles provided crucial support, and the presence of more experienced troops among the assault waves helped maintain momentum despite casualties. At Omaha Beach, everything went wrong simultaneously. The bombing missed, The naval bombardment was insufficient. The amphibious tanks sank. Specialized engineer vehicles were delayed or destroyed, and troops came ashore at exactly the wrong locations facing the strongest defenses. The result was a disaster that came perilously close to complete failure. For the German gunners at Omaha, those first hours represented both their finest moment from a purely military standpoint and the beginning of their doom. They performed exactly as their training and doctrine intended, delivering devastating fire onto the exposed attackers. Some crews fired so many rounds that they went through multiple spare barrels as each one overheated and had to be changed. Empty ammunition boxes piled up in the bunkers. The noise inside these confined concrete spaces was overwhelming, the crash of incoming naval shells mixing with the continuous hammering of their own weapons. Visibility was limited to narrow firing slits, giving the crews a constrained view of the larger battle. What they could see was carnage on a scale few had witnessed before, even those who had fought on the Eastern Front. Bodies floated in the surf, the sand was littered with dead and wounded men, burning vehicles sent up columns of black smoke, and still more landing craft kept coming, disgorging more troops directly into the killing zone. From the German perspective in those early hours, they seemed to be winning. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, stopping the invasion at the water's edge. Some crews probably felt a grim satisfaction at their effectiveness, while others felt sick at what they were doing but kept firing because that was their job and their orders, and stopping meant the position would be overrun. The psychological state of men in combat is complex and contradictory. You can be terrified and determined simultaneously, disgusted by what you're doing while also feeling pride in your technical competence, desperately wanting the killing to stop while knowing that stopping will likely mean your own death. The MG42 gunners at Omaha experienced all of these emotions in those hours while their fingers stayed on the triggers and the belts kept feeding through. But the Germans couldn't see what was happening beyond their limited fields of view. They couldn't see that despite horrific casualties, some American troops were managing to find dead ground where the guns couldn't reach them, were beginning to organize themselves, were identifying the source of fire that was pinning them down. They couldn't see small groups of soldiers beginning to work their way forward using every scrap of cover available. They couldn't see officers and sergeants rallying their men, convincing or ordering them to move despite their terror. The Germans in their bunkers had no way of knowing that the battle was slowly, painfully beginning to turn against them. Individual acts of courage and small unit initiative started to crack the defensive line. A destroyer captain, seeing the carnage on the beach, brought his ship in close enough to nearly beach it so his guns could fire directly at bunkers at point-blank range, silencing several positions. Engineers managed to clear some obstacles and blow gaps in the seawall. Troops found gullies and ravines leading up the bluffs and began infiltrating past the strongpoints rather than assaulting them directly. By mid-morning, the situation for the German defenders had become increasingly desperate, even if many didn't realize it yet. Communication between positions was breaking down as American fire cut telephone lines and radio operators were killed. Ammunition resupply became problematic as the routes from the rear came under fire. Casualties mounted among the defenders as well, not from frontal assault but from naval gunfire that was becoming increasingly accurate as forward observers ashore called in fire, and from mortar rounds that began falling once American crews got their weapons into action. Some positions found themselves surrounded as American troops worked around their flanks. The decision of when to stop fighting and attempt surrender became increasingly urgent and increasingly fraught with danger and uncertainty. For Heinrich Sevelow in WN62, the moment came when he literally ran out of ammunition after 9 hours of nearly continuous firing. With American troops closing in on the position from multiple directions and no prospect of resupply or relief, continuing to fight meant certain death with no purpose. He made the decision to run, abandoning his position and his weapon, focused solely on survival. Many of his comrades made different choices. Some stayed at their posts and died there. Some attempted to surrender and were shot anyway. either because the Americans couldn't or wouldn't accept their surrender in the heat of battle, or because some angry soldier decided that after what these men had done, they didn't deserve mercy. Some successfully surrendered and found themselves treated correctly as prisoners of war, sometimes even receiving medical treatment for their wounds. There was no single fate that awaited all the MG42 crews, but rather a range of outcomes determined by individual circumstances, the attitudes of the specific American soldiers they encountered, and substantial elements of chance. The accounts of German prisoners taken at Omaha reveal interesting patterns. Many expressed genuine shock at the scale of the invasion, having convinced themselves that if it came, it would be something they could handle. The reality of the vast armada overwhelmed their mental preparation. Many were physically and emotionally exhausted, having fought for hours under tremendous stress with no food, little water, and no rest. Some appeared almost relieved to be captured, glad the nightmare was over and they had survived. Others seemed sullen or defiant, and interrogators noted that younger soldiers who had been more thoroughly indoctrinated tended to be less cooperative than older veterans who had seen enough of war to be sick of it. Almost none admitted to being MG42 gunners if they could avoid it, usually claiming they had been ammunition carriers or simply infantrymen who happened to be in a bunker when the Americans arrived. This wasn't just fear of reprisal, though that was certainly a factor. It was also a psychological distancing from what they had done, a way of not having to fully confront their role in the slaughter. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, protected from violence and intimidation, provided with adequate food and medical care, and eventually repatriated to their home countries after hostilities ended. In practice, these requirements weren't always perfectly followed in the immediate aftermath of combat. Prisoners taken in the heat of battle sometimes received rough treatment, though serious abuses were relatively rare and usually punished when discovered. The vast majority of German soldiers captured at Normandy survived their captivity and eventually returned home, though that return often came years after the war's end, depending on which Allied nation held them. Those captured by the Americans or British generally fared better than those who ended up in Soviet hands, though even American and British camps could be grim places with inadequate food and shelter, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the invasion when the logistics system was still struggling to supply even frontline combat troops adequately. For German gunners who survived the initial battle and the immediate aftermath only to be captured days or weeks later during the fighting inland, their experience was often different from those taken on the beaches. By then, the raw intensity of emotion had diminished somewhat, and prisoners were more likely to be treated according to proper procedures. Interrogators would question them about their units, their mission, what they knew about German dispositions and plans. Most prisoners provided minimal information beyond name, rank, and serial number as they were trained to do, though some proved more talkative, and even small bits of tactical information could prove valuable to Allied intelligence officers trying to piece together the overall German defensive scheme. After interrogation, prisoners were moved to the rear, eventually to camps in Britain or North America, where they would spend months or years waiting for the war to end and their eventual return home. The psychological impact of the experience on these men varied enormously. Some adapted relatively well, treating their captivity as an unfortunate but survivable interlude. They found ways to occupy themselves, learned the language of their captors, made the best of a bad situation. Others fell into depression, consumed by guilt over having survived when comrades died, or by shame at having surrendered rather than fighting to the death as their oaths and propaganda had demanded. The cognitive dissonance between what they had been told about fighting to the last and the reality of their situation could be profound. Then there was the slowly dawning realization as the war continued and Germany's situation deteriorated that perhaps surrendering had saved their lives and that dying in a bunker at Omaha would have been a futile waste. The weapons themselves that the crews had operated became trophies and souvenirs when American troops overran the positions. MG42s captured intact were highly prized. Some were sent back to the United States for technical evaluation. Others were appropriated by frontline units who recognized the gun's superiority to many Allied weapons and pressed them into service, though ammunition supply was always a problem. Many were simply destroyed to prevent any possibility of the Germans recovering and reusing them. The massive concrete bunkers that had housed these weapons were sometimes repurposed by American forces as command posts or aid stations, but many were simply left as they were, gradually being reclaimed by vegetation and time. Today, walking the Norman coast, you can still enter some of these positions, peer through the same firing slits that framed such terrible scenes, and try to imagine what it was like for men on both sides during those hours when the world's fate hung in the balance. The broader strategic outcome of D-Day ensured that the MG42 crew's sacrifice or survival was ultimately futile from Germany's perspective. The Allies established their lodgment, built up their forces, broke out from the beachhead, and drove across France. The Atlantic Wall, such as it was, had been breached. Whatever individual crews accomplished on June 6th couldn't change the trajectory of a war that Germany was already losing. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombers were systematically destroying German cities and industrial capacity, and the resources available to defend in the West were inadequate to the task. For the individual soldiers manning those guns, these grand strategic realities might have seemed abstract or irrelevant compared to the immediate tactical situation of holding their position or dying in the attempt. But the gap between their tactical success in those morning hours and strategic failure was vast. Researchers and historians studying D-Day have given considerable attention to the Allied perspective, understandably so given that it was an Allied victory, and most of the archives and veterans willing to talk were on that side. The German perspective, particularly that of low-ranking soldiers like MG42 crew members, was harder to recover. Many records were lost in the chaos of Germany's defeat. Many veterans chose not to discuss their experiences, either from trauma or from shame, or simply because post-war German society wanted to move forward rather than dwell on the past. When German veterans did speak publicly about their wartime experiences, they often faced suspicion about their motives and criticism for any hint of seeming to glorify or justify their service. The result is that we have fewer detailed first-hand German accounts of the battle than we might wish for, though enough exist to piece together the general experience. What comes through in the accounts that do exist is the overwhelming sensory intensity of the experience. The noise was literally deafening. The sustained fire of an MG42 in a confined concrete space loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage. And that was before you added the crash of naval shells hitting nearby. The smell was overwhelming. Cordite from fired ammunition mixed with the acrid smoke and dust from explosions, the salt tang of the ocean, often the smell of blood and worse from wounded or dead comrades in the same bunker. The physical sensation of fatigue as hours of combat wore on, the strain of maintaining focus and continuing to operate your weapon effectively when every instinct screamed at you to curl up and make yourself small and wait for it to be over. The emotional whiplash between moments of feeling almost godlike in your power as you cut down attackers and moments of pure terror when a near miss reminded you that you were just as mortal and vulnerable as the men you were shooting. The tactics that American troops developed to deal with MG42 positions evolved through brutal trial and error. Early attempts at frontal assault almost always failed with heavy casualties. The successful approaches generally involved some combination of suppressive fire, smoke to obscure the gunner's vision, maneuver to get troops around to the flanks or rear of the position, and then close assault with explosives and small arms. Flamethrowers were particularly effective, but required getting very close, within tens of meters, and the soldier carrying a flamethrower was a priority target since everyone recognized the threat they posed. Tank support was invaluable when available. A tank's main gun could often blast through firing ports or demolish the structure of smaller bunkers, but tanks were scarce on Omaha in those critical first hours. Naval gunfire support was powerful but imprecise, and often couldn't be safely used once friendly troops were close to a German position. Individual soldiers developed their own techniques and superstitions. Some swore that zigzagging while running made you harder to hit, though whether this was actually true or just gave soldiers something to do that felt proactive is debatable. Some believed that the MG42's rate of fire was so high that it was actually less accurate than slower-firing weapons, that the muzzle climb and barrel heating degraded aim, though this was small comfort when the sheer volume of fire meant that even degraded accuracy could be deadly. Some soldiers convinced themselves that the gunners couldn't see them through the narrow firing slits if they approached from certain angles. And sometimes this was true. The limited field of view was a genuine weakness of bunker design, but betting your life on it was still a terrifying gamble. The integration of different weapons and units was crucial to eventually reducing the defences. Combat engineers with demolitions were essential for destroying bunkers that infantry couldn't reduce with small arms alone. Artillery observers calling in fire from the ships offshore could suppress positions even if they couldn't destroy them outright. Medics pulling wounded men to safety allowed others to keep pushing forward rather than stopping to help. Officers and sergeants providing leadership and direction prevented soldiers from freezing or running and kept units moving with purpose even when the situation seemed hopeless. No single element could have succeeded alone, but together, step by step, they gradually dismantled the German defensive system. By early afternoon on June 6th, the critical moment had passed. American troops held the high ground, the beach was being cleared and organised, reinforcements were flowing ashore, and the German positions that remained were isolated and being systematically eliminated. The question was no longer whether the invasion would succeed, but how quickly the beachhead could be expanded and exploited. For the German defenders, this moment brought a stark clarity. The battle was lost. Holding out longer wouldn't change the outcome, would only mean more deaths among comrades to no purpose. Yet surrendering carried its own risks and uncertainties, and different soldiers made different choices based on their assessment of those risks. The days and weeks following the invasion saw continued fighting as the Allies pushed inland and the Germans attempted to contain and counterattack the beachhead. MG42 crews continued to play their deadly role, now fighting from the hedgerows of the bocage rather than concrete bunkers. The weapon remained as dangerous as ever, but the tactical situation was fundamentally different. Attackers could now maneuver more freely, use cover more effectively, and bring overwhelming force to bear on specific points. German forces were constantly retreating, never able to establish solid defensive lines before they were outflanked or overwhelmed. The MG42 gunners fought and died in countless small engagements that never made it into the history books, their contribution to Germany's cause diminishing each day as Allied strength grew and German capacity waned. Some of the men who survived Omaha Beach fell in these later battles. Some were captured in the eventual collapse of German forces in Normandy when thousands were surrounded in the Falaise pocket. Some managed to escape and retreat back toward Germany, there to fight again in later battles or to desert when the opportunity arose. The individual fates were as varied as the men themselves. What united them was the shared experience of that day in June when they manned their weapons and fought against the tide of history, believing or hoping they could turn it back, only to discover that some tides are too powerful to resist. The psychological burden of that experience stayed with many for the rest of their lives, showing up in nightmares, in sudden moments of dissociation when something triggered a memory, in difficulty forming close relationships because of survivors' guilt, in all the myriad ways that trauma manifests itself. The reunion between Cervello and Silva decades later represents a kind of healing that few participants in such violent events ever achieve. The ability to sit down with someone you tried to kill, or who tried to kill you, and find common ground as fellow human beings who were caught up in forces beyond their control, requires a degree of maturity and emotional courage that shouldn't be underestimated. Not every veteran could do it, and many who tried found it reopened wounds rather than healing them. But for those who could navigate that difficult terrain, there was the possibility of finding some measure of peace and closure. The understanding that your enemy was also just a scared young man following orders, doing what he thought was right or at least necessary, can be both comforting and deeply troubling. It complicates the simple moral narratives that people prefer, where one side is purely good and the other purely evil, forcing an acknowledgement of the humanity on both sides and the tragedy of that humanity being set in opposition. The technical legacy of the MG42 extends beyond its use in World War II. The basic design was so successful that it continued in service with various militaries for decades after the war, modified and updated, but retaining the core features that made it effective. The modern German military's MG3 is a direct descendant, and the influence of the design can be seen in numerous other weapons developed around the world. From a purely engineering perspective, divorced from the moral weight of what it was used for, the MG42 represents a remarkable achievement in weapons design, a machine gun that balanced rate of fire, reliability, durability, and ease of manufacture in a way that few other weapons have matched. That this same design excellence made it such a devastating killer of human beings is the paradox at the heart of weapons development. That technical innovation in service of destruction is still innovation, and the engineers who created it were still brilliant at their craft, even as their work enabled tremendous suffering. Walking the beaches today, the contrast between the peaceful scene and the violent history is jarring. Tourists take photos, children build sandcastles, couples walk hand in hand, all on ground that was once literally soaked with blood and littered with bodies. The physical scars have mostly healed. The bunkers remain, but they're empty and silent, graffiti-covered monuments to a battle long past. The memorial cemeteries nearby hold the graves of thousands who fell, neat rows of white crosses and stars of David stretching across manicured lawns, each marker representing a life cut short, a family's grief, a future that never came to be. Veterans who return to these places often break down, the memories flooding back with overwhelming force, the gap between then and now simultaneously vast and non-existent as past and present collapse into each other. For younger generations, it's history, important but abstract, hard to truly comprehend beyond an intellectual understanding that something terrible happened here. The lived experience of those who were there, on both sides, can never be fully transmitted or understood by those who weren't, no matter how many books they read or documentaries they watch or museums they visit. Some things can only be known through experience, and most of us should be grateful we'll never have that particular knowledge. The question of what happened to the MG42 crews has no single answer because there were hundreds of individual crews and hundreds of individual fates. Some died in their bunkers, some surrendered and survived the war, some escaped and fought elsewhere, some were wounded and died later from their injuries, some went mad from the stress, some carried on with apparent normalcy. The attempt to find a single narrative that encompasses all of them is futile, yet the effort to understand the range of experiences and outcomes is worthwhile, because it reminds us that history isn't just the movement of armies and the decisions of leaders, but also the countless individual human stories that make up those larger patterns. Each man behind each gun had his own story, his own reasons for being there, his own fears and hopes and regrets. Most of those stories are lost now, the men who could tell them long dead and often having chosen not to share them even when alive. What remains are fragments, glimpses, enough to sketch the outlines of the experience, but never to fully capture it. The survivors who did speak about their experiences often emphasized certain themes. The randomness of survival, how death took the man next to you but spared you for no reason you could discern. The speed with which everything happened, despite also feeling like time had slowed to a crawl. The way training took over when conscious thought became impossible. The unexpected kindness or cruelty of individual moments amid the overall chaos. The impossibility of explaining to anyone who wasn't there what it was actually like. The frustration with movies and books that got it wrong, that made it seem more glorious or more comprehensible than the messy, terrifying reality. the ambivalence about their own actions, pride in having done their duty mixed with horror at what that duty entailed, the complicated feelings toward former enemies, respect for their courage and skill mixed with residual anger at what they did. The sense that the most important events of their lives happened during a few hours or days during the war, and everything since has been aftermath, a long denouement to a story whose climax came in their youth. For those interested in deeper understanding, the path leads through multiple sources. Official military histories provide the strategic and operational framework. Unit records and after-action reports give tactical details. Personal memoirs offer individual perspectives. Oral history projects have captured the voices of veterans while it was still possible. Archaeological investigations of the battle sites themselves reveal physical evidence. All these sources have to be weighed and cross-referenced and treated critically, recognizing that all accounts are partial and shaped by the perspective and limitations of their authors. The men who write memoirs are often officers or NCOS, not average enlisted men, and they write years or decades after events when memory has faded and been reshaped. Official records reflect what commanders knew and chose to report, not necessarily what actually happened on the ground. Physical evidence is fragmentary and requires interpretation. The full truth remains elusive, approachable, but never quite reachable, which is perhaps the case with all historical understanding, but particularly so for events as chaotic and traumatic as combat. What we can say with certainty is that the MG42 crews at Normandy found themselves at a pivotal moment in history, whether they fully grasped it or not. Their actions in those hours had real consequences, delaying the Allied advance, inflicting casualties that rippled through families and communities, shaping the detailed course of the battle even as they couldn't affect its ultimate outcome. They performed their assigned role with varying degrees of skill and commitment, some fighting with fierce determination, others going through the motions while hoping to survive, most somewhere in between. When the moment came to choose between continuing to fight and attempting to surrender, they made different choices based on different calculations and different values and different circumstances. Some of those choices led to survival, some to death, and which often came down to luck. In the aftermath, those who lived carried the weight of what they had experienced and what they had done, finding various ways to cope or fail to cope with that burden. Their stories, pieced together from fragments, give us a glimpse into the human dimension of warfare that statistics and strategic analyses cannot capture, reminding us that the names on casualty lists and the impersonal forces described in history books are always, in the end, about individual human beings making choices under impossible pressure and living or failing to live with the consequences.